When we think about power, we often see it through the lens of violence, embodied by authority figures like the police, the military, or gang members. Alternatively, we might picture it as a shadowy bureaucracy, where unseen figures issue commands from above, which determine our fate in ways that we cannot comprehend. But what if this was only part of the story? What if this partial view, far from helping us understand our condition, does in fact alienate us even more, contributing to our servitude rather than to our freedom? In our first video on Foucault and Deleuze, we have seen how Foucault had discovered power as the thing that conditions knowledge. Power is defined as the set of microphysical relations that determine the macrophysical structures of knowledge, meaning that these structures could not be known, but only enacted. It's an immediate action. Knowledge, on the other hand, is defined as strata that pertains to any social institution, any idea, any representation that can take the form of a structure. But this poses a problem with regards to what we can know about power. If we cannot know it, then does it even exist? Consider, for example, what Foucault says in a later text. The exercise of power is not simply a relationship between partners, individual or collective. It is a way in which certain actions modify others. Which is to say, of course, that something called power, with or without a capital letter, which is assumed to exist universally in a concentrated or diffused form, does not exist. Power exists only when it is put into action, even if, of course, it is integrated into a disparate field of possibilities brought to bear upon permanent structures. This dualism between action and structure defines the relation between power and knowledge as a tension between the micro and the macrophysical levels. It means that we cannot know power, and we cannot enact knowledge, so to speak. But the problem then is this: how can we study power at all and make it an act of knowledge? And similarly, how can we use knowledge here and now in order to exercise judgment? We saw how Deleuze identified subjectivation as the third term that made power and knowledge homogeneous to each other, and thus allowed to reconciliate them in a unique metaphysical framework. But we did not see how. So in this video, we're going to examine this relation in more detail, step by step, and we're going to use a drawing made by Deleuze at the end of his book on Foucault, which explains this relation and represents the focal point of the text. First, we will see Deleuze's negative definition of power, by which he dismantles our representational and often stereotypical views of power. We will see how this allows him to formulate a positive definition in the form of the concept of diagram of power, which is what we can see in this drawing, and how, finally, he can solve the paradox of subjectivity, by which the subject, appearing between stratas of the visible and the utterable, precedes power, but is also an effect of the relation between the two stratas of knowledge. Perhaps you would agree that knowledge is power, and logic in particular is one of the greatest skills that somebody can develop. That's where today's sponsor, Brilliant, comes in. Brilliant is your go-to platform for learning by doing, offering thousands of interactive lessons in math, programming, data science, and AI. Whether you're starting fresh or mastering advanced skills, Brilliant makes learning engaging, hands-on, and rewarding. Brilliant's visual approach helps you truly understand concepts from within, as it were. Instead of passively watching videos, you get hands-on interactive problem-solving experiences, which is proven to be 6 times more effective than passive learning. Even if you're busy, Brilliant makes learning a part of your daily routine with lessons that only take a few minutes. It's the perfect way to keep your mind sharp without the mindless scrolling. If you're into programming, for example, as I am at the moment, Brilliant's Python courses let you build real projects from day one. You'll learn essential coding elements and start thinking like a programmer in no time. To explore everything Brilliant offers, try it for free for 30 days by using the QR code on screen or by clicking the link in the description. Plus, you'll get 20% off an annual premium subscription. Start working on your skills today. Big thanks to Brilliant for sponsoring this video. Foucault distinguishes between power and structures, as we have mentioned. Power is the object of a microphysics of power, as he says, while the structure is defined as a macrophysics. Micro and macro do not designate scales or sizes, but they show the condition for an understanding of power. In his earlier works, Foucault analyzed power through institutions like schools, prisons, and factories, which defined the macrophysics of power, the domain of knowledge and representation. It is only later that he discovered the realm of the microphysical, a level of analysis that is deeper than institutional structures. This allowed him to show how things like culture, individuality, and history itself emerge from power relations, and it led to a great shift in his own theory of power. In the history of sexuality, for example, Foucault argues that we shouldn't define power centers as institutions or representations, but rather as small acts of power permeating a society. New workplace rules, emerging status symbols, new administrative protocols, etc. This is what it means that power is not fundamentally a structures, but rather something that we do. In this sense, there is a power of structuration that transforms microphysical relations of power into large-scale structural control and violence. Deleuze is fascinated by this model. He says, in the first place, we must understand that power is not a form, such as the state form, and that the power relation does not lie between two forms, as does knowledge. In order to undo the formal or macrophysical definition of power, Deleuze formulates 6 postulates that allow us to describe the first step in Foucault's great shift. It allows us to define what power is not. It is in this sense that it's a negative definition. First, there is the property postulate. Power is not a property, contrary to what people usually think. So it's not something that belongs to a dominant class, for example. As Deleuze explains, this new functionalism or functional analysis that he is trying to implement following Foucault certainly does not deny the existence of class and class struggle, but illustrates it in a totally different way. In brief, power is not homogeneous, but can be defined only by the particular points through which it passes. If power is heterogeneous, it means that it cannot be localized anywhere. This is the point of the second postulate, which is called the localization postulate. There, Deleuze shows that discipline does not belong essentially to a centralized institution. He says, one of the basic ideas in discipline and punish is that modern societies can be defined as disciplinarian. But discipline cannot be identified with any one institution or apparatus precisely because it is a type of power, a technology that traverses every kind of apparatus or institution, linking them, prolonging them, and making them converge and function in a new way. Power is both nowhere and everywhere. So Deleuze says, here we can see that local has 2 very different meanings. Power is local because it is never global, but it is not local or localized because it is diffuse. This is the point of the third postulate, which is called the subordination postulate. Rather than power being subordinated to centralized modes of production, for example, the economy itself presupposes internal power relations. The thing called power is characterized by immanence of field without transcendent unification, continuity of line without global centralization, and contiguity of parts without distinct totalization. It is a social space. Because it is decentralized, power does not have an essence. It's not a great unity. Postulate number 4, which is called the essence or attribute postulate, shows following Foucault that even in France's Ancien Régime, power wasn't exclusively the king's possession. In fact, the king would often act as a simple arbitrator between people who were trying to lock each other up for whatever reason. As Deleuze says, Foucault demonstrates that the king's arbitrator does not operate in a downward direction, like an attribute of his transcendent power, but is solicited by the most humble, by the relatives, neighbors, and colleagues of a nasty little troublemaker who want to have him locked up, and who use the absolute monarchy like an imminent public service that can settle family or conjugal arguments, professional quarrels, or disputes over byways. This is why Deleuze can say that power is not an attribute. It is found as much in the dominant class than in the dominated, in the king and in the subjects. This implies that power is not primarily ideological. It's not about making subjects think what we want. So postulate number 5, called the modality postulate, shows that power does not rely primarily on informing minds. As Deleuze says, power does not come about through ideology, even when it concerns the soul. It does not necessarily separate through violence and repression, even when it weighs on the body. Instead, power produces reality before it tries to change it, or tries to repress it. We will see exactly how in a moment. But this does not mean, however, that power is a hidden law, like the laws of physics, waiting to be discovered. And this is what the final principle, the legality postulate, addresses. In his writings, Foucault replaces the overly crude opposition between law and illegality with a more nuanced correlation between illegalisms and laws in the plural form. The body of laws is structured in reaction to illegalisms, which it differentiates by formalizing them into the law. Laws are therefore the strategic tool of an ongoing war against illegalism. It is not centralized, but it is fundamentally opportunistic. That's why Deleuze says, what is common to both republics and monarchies in the West is that they raised the whole entity of law to the status of the assumed principle of power in order to give themselves a homogeneous representation of jurisdiction. The juridical model became the blueprint for all strategies. These 6 postulates are made to show that power is not what we usually think. It's not an abstract entity that should be used to explain how we act, but rather it is always and already contained in what we do, in our actions, even when those actions are directed against institutions of power. Of course, it's very true that institutions can exercise power in the form of harassment or libel or lawfare, but this constitutes power only insofar as it is an action, and because it is usually directed at specific purposes, it's a form of violence rather than power. If we ground our understanding of power on those macro constructs, including violence, we will fail to understand what it really is. So the time has come to ask Deleuze and Foucault if they have a positive definition of power. We are now in a better position to understand Deleuze's drawing. The positive definition of power implies that for each negative aspect, there is a positive one that allows us to understand power as a microphysical relation rather than a macrophysical structure. The property postulate denies that power is contained in stratas of knowledge. Rather, Deleuze argues, it is contained in a function of power that describes how we act. So to the concept of strata, he opposes the concept of strategy, which means that we must distinguish between the two. Strategy operates at the microphysical level, while strata represents the global macro effects of these power relations. In a sense, everything else follows from here. If power is a microphysical relation, then it is decentralized. It does not come from an institution, but from a set of relations. Power must also be immanent to its expression, specifically to modes of production defined as infrastructure. If power is not an essence, then it means that microphysical structures are events, such that everything is a force, though the micro level represents a different type of force, which are not active but reactive. Power is not an ideology, but it selects certain ideas that it wants to emphasize, and it reacts to illegalisms by the creation of new laws, not by the application of a central principle. Deleuze summarizes these points as follows. These power relations at the macrophysical level, which are simultaneously local, unstable, and diffuse, do not emanate from a central point or unique locus of sovereignty, but at each moment move from one point to another in a field of forces, marking inflections, resistances, twists and turns, when one changes direction or retraces one's steps. This is why they are not localized at any given moment. They constitute a strategy, an exercise of the non-stratified, and these anonymous strategies are almost mute and blind, since they evade all stable forms of the visible and the articulable. This is to say that what is seen and what is said, the visible and the articulable, operate at the stratic level. They are macrophysical entities, and therefore they are effects and not causes of power. We could say that Deleuze's drawing does not represent something above and something below, but rather it represents a surface. It's as if we were watching the map of a territory. But this map is ever-changing, and what it shows is a potential for differentiation, different types of balances between the microstructure and the microphysical levels, each of which produces a different form of state, or state apparatus. The fact that this drawing is ever-changing is what makes it what Deleuze calls a diagram, and indeed it is something that belongs to the realm of forces itself. As Deleuze says, strategies differ from stratifications, as diagrams differ from archives. A diagram is a strategy, which means that it cannot be defined in terms of what it is, but rather in terms of what it does. And as Deleuze says, we can therefore conceive of a necessarily open list of variables expressing a relation between forces or power relation, constituting actions upon action, to incite, to induce, to seduce, to make easy or difficult, to enlarge or limit, to make more or less probable, and so on. All of these are manners in which the diagram can show different implementations of power. We have seen that Deleuze regressed from the stratic level of microphysics to the macrophysical strategies by a process of negation. This negation can now be replaced by the positive definition that we have just seen. What these variables do, the technical process that they make possible in order for the microphysical relation to pass to the macrophysical structures, is a process called integration. As Deleuze says, power relations are the differential relations which determine particular features, affects. The actualization which stabilizes and stratifies them is an integration, an operation which consists of tracing a line of general force, linking, aligning, and homogenizing particular features, placing them in series and making them converge. Yet there is no immediate global integration. There is rather a multiplicity of local and partial integrations, each one entertaining an affinity with certain relations or particular points. The integration factors or agents of stratification make up institutions, not just the state, but also the family, religion, production, the marketplace, art itself, morality, and so on. The institutions are not sources or essences, and have neither essence nor interiority. This means that at every moment, the macro-physical structures that we experience are produced from within by this process of integration. This integration creates a consolidation at the stratic level, but it forms not one, but two domains that are mutually exclusive, and which we have already seen, namely the visible and the utterable. As Deleuze explains, knowledge concerns formed matters, substances, and formalized functions, divided up segment by segment according to the two great formal conditions of seeing and speaking, light and language. It is therefore stratified, archivized, and endowed with a relatively rigid segmentarity. We are now in a better position to understand the notion of subjectivation. From one perspective, which we can call empirical, the subject begins its subjective journey between the two stratas of the visible and the utterable. Empiricism as a method takes visibilities, such as the fact that the sun rises every day, and produces utterances that have no ground in reality, such as the sun will rise tomorrow, which is something that I cannot know. As such, the subject sees itself as the point of departure in the metaphysical process that constitutes knowledge. In this view, the subject is defined by its ability to create and to make statements. But from a second perspective, the subject is itself the effect of micro-relations of power, which it cannot know in advance, but only analyze as conditions for the creation of knowledge. Finding the conditions of apparition of a thing is what defines, following Kant, the transcendental method. The combination of these two approaches, empiricism and transcendental philosophy, gives way to Deleuze's own method, and perhaps you can see why he called it transcendental empiricism. On the one hand, the subject receives information, on the other, it creates information. As such, the subject is the locus of change, the place where the cosmos looks at itself and changes accordingly, like a mirror reflecting another mirror. It is true that the diagram drawn by Deleuze can perhaps best be understood when we interpret the space of subjectivation in terms of an individual subjectivity, a person like you or I, and it is true that it works very well in such a situation. But the greatest strength of Deleuze's model is that it also allows us to interpret other phenomena, such as society throughout history, as a process of subjectivation. On the one hand, Deleuze can say within a few pages that the diagram is both an immanent cause, much like the concept of a life that he described in his ultimate text, and which we have examined a little while ago, and at the same time describe history itself as a succession of diagrams. Diagrams come in an infinite number of shapes and sizes, so to speak, but they always oppose something that is active, like the microphysical level, to something that is passive, like the macrophysical level. But because everything is a force, including macrophysical structures, there always remains, within the macrophysical, elements of microphysics, in the form of an immediacy of relations that effectuates a change in a subject, whether this subject is an individual or historical period. You can say ultimately that the microphysical level is an active force, while the macrophysical level, the structures, pertain to reactive forces. To take one last very tempting example, let us see if we can understand Foucault's model for social control in terms of diagrams. If you recall, Foucault defined two main types of models of confinement, the leprosy model and the plague model. They referred to the manner in which medieval societies reacted against both of these diseases. And Foucault has famously shown how these models have informed how more modern societies treat mad people and delinquents. It has become the blueprint for our model of imprisonment. The leprosy model describes how medieval societies treated those afflicted by leprosy by exiling them outside of its walls. This implied a clear model of inside and outside, a literal macrophysical relation of exteriority. But on the other hand, the plague model reflects how medieval authorities could not simply exile those afflicted by the plague because it was too contagious, too rapid. And so instead they had to go from house to house within the city and keep a log of which house was sick and which was not. In so doing, it created a kind of inner, microphysical form of confinement. As Deleuze says, the imprisonment of madmen was imposed like an exile and took the leper as its model, while the confinement of delinquents was carried out by partitioning and took its model from the plague victim. These two models, Foucault shows, are not clear-cut and they always mix with each other to some degree in reality. The famous Panopticon is essentially an expression of the plague model, with a bit of leprosy, as it shows a kind of inner exclusion, where prisoners can be seen without them seeing. It's a prison of light. I want to send a heartfelt thank you to my wonderful patrons for their kind support. If you too would like to support this channel, please go to the description and follow the links to my Patreon or Ko-fi. I'm really thankful for your support. For now, thank you all for watching, and see you soon.